Is interested, this is the book I mentioned yesterday that was just screaming for attention at the convenience store. And there's two little chapters on Montana. It takes a state and then it gives like two stories from each of the western states. Kansas, you might not consider that a western state, but at one time that was a western state. And there are still some of us who consider it at least a midwestern state. And we actually have a lot of cowboy stuff in western Kansas, even eastern Kansas. So it qualifies. But there is Kansas, Missouri, two stories on Montana. One of them is the slaughter of the buffalo in 1883, and the other is the hard winter of 86, 87. And I'll bet that's the same hard winter that hit Kansas. I got to go back and look. But in Kansas, in the late 1800s, probably the same year, as Montana, the snow was so deep, it snowed so many days in a row, nonstop, that cabins were completely covered over between the depth of the snow and the wind and the drifts, that when it finally stopped, those who could dig themselves out went to all the settlements where they knew there were people with long poles trying to find the cabins, and when they did, trying to get inside to find out if people were still alive. There was one home where a family of, I think, a husband and wife and 5 children, they burned up all the firewood, then they broke up all the wooden furniture for heat to burn it up. When they ran out of that, they all climbed into one bed and piled all the blankets on one bed, and it still got so cold when they finally got to them, there were no survivors. But even western Kansas back in the 1800s was a tough, tough place to live. And people that moved into Kansas, what some of them had to do when they first got there, you know, there's no trees. So before they could build their sod house, they would actually dig a hole in the ground, try to find an embankment, dig a hole in the ground, and they lived in a hole in the ground. And that was also true of places in eastern Colorado, I understand, Oklahoma, probably Texas, Nebraska. But can you imagine, you just get married, you take your bride out west and say, honey, wait till you see the house I have for you. And it's a hole in the ground. But our ancestors were tough, rugged people. And there's a historian in Idaho named Michael Hoffman. And some people think he's a rather radical historian. But he also covers contemporary issues, and people will ask him, why don't we have the country that we did in the 1800s? Why don't we have the integrity of leadership? Why don't we have some of the, why don't we have some of the faith that we do that undergirded our country then? Why do we have so many attempts by people to take away our liberties and take away our rights, especially from the people that are law-abiding and are going to abide by the law and not abuse their freedom, whether it's with a firearm or the speed of a vehicle on a highway? Why do we have the country that we used to have? And he says, because we don't have the people we used to have. You know, our ancestors, came out into a country like this, whether it's western Kansas or this, with no money, a shovel, and a handful of seeds. And they made a life. That's pretty tough. They didn't ask anybody for anything. Now, they knew when they needed help, perhaps building their house. And people would get, it doesn't mean they were not so individualistic that they didn't rely on each other. When there was an illness, when there was a rattlesnake bite, when there was a bad storm, when there was harvest, they got together and they helped and they put up houses together. They knew when they needed somebody to help shoulder a burden. But for the things that everybody was capable of doing, such as digging your own row, planting your own seed, hauling the water from the river in a bucket to water the crops, they did it without asking for help. And when a catastrophe struck, they didn't ask the government to deliver them. They prayed to God and they worked with each other. And he said the reason we had a republic like we did is because we had people who worked like they did. And once we get back to that kind of environment, then we will have that kind of country once again. And you know what that made me do? It made me go out. I have a small backyard, and I've wanted to do this for some time anyway. I couldn't plant a garden, so I went out and got a bunch of buckets and planted a bucket garden in my backyard. Okay, I know I'm not a pioneer in the West, breaking the ground for the first time, but there's something about getting your hands in the dirt. planting a garden, even if it's a small one in your backyard, and buckets you have to buy, and with potted soil you have to buy and put in the bucket. Get your fingers in the dirt, get the dirt under your fingernails. If you have little kids, let them see what it's like. We did it in Cody. I didn't have great luck because of the area I picked. There were so many weeds, but what I did do is I planted a garden, planted some watermelon seeds, and my daughter says, "Daddy, when are we ever going to get a watermelon?" And I said, "Soon, dear." And the next trip to town, I got a watermelon and put it in the garden. And I told Kristen, I said, "Dear, maybe you ought to just go," I think it was 4th of July, I said, "You ought to just go check the garden again, see what's happening." And she comes running in, "Daddy, Daddy!" Well, she didn't think it was so funny when she found out years later what I did. But at the time, it created that pioneer spirit. Ministering to the marginalized. Before we get started on this, we have an option Friday night, I guess. Some camps don't do a worship service on Friday night because there's the talent show, and there's people saying goodbye, and there's so much other stuff going on. So Richard and Dawn gave me the option of what would you like to do? And I says, well, I'm the visitor to this camp. And by the way, thank you for being so gracious, welcoming my family and me into this week of camp. I know that each week kind of develops its own personality. You have people that come together, the same people for 10, 12, 15 years. You form your own family, and it's gracious of you to welcome someone else in, so thank you. So I don't want to come in here and tell you what we're doing Friday night because it's your camp. But Richard said I could just offer that no, we don't have a worship service. Yes, we have a regular service, or we have a short one. So whatever you would like to do. I would really like to do the shrewd servant for the parable tonight. That's the one where he cheats his master out of his master's property, but the master still commends him for being wise. That's one of the parables that I tell you I just have to keep thinking on because the meaning is not just, kind of self-evident in any way. So I want to go over that one tonight, which leaves my favorite parable, of course, is the prodigal son, but we could do something real short on Friday night. One song and a quick devotional with that parable. But the option's up to you. We'll have 3 options. Can we have a vote? A regular length, none at all, or a short one. We'll start with none at all. Who would prefer not to have it? And this is no reflection on you. You know how busy. No, I don't come to Bible camp to worship, thank you. It's not that at all. You know how jam-packed Friday night is. And if you think it's best to not have a service, that is no negative reflection on you. You've been having them all week long. You're still a spiritual person. Yeah, before the talent show. Would you rather, let's start off with a regular one, then a short one, then none. Would you like to have a regular full-length worship service? Okay. Who would rather have a short one, a very shortened version? Who would rather have none at all? Okay. Okay, I want you to look back at the 2 that raised their hand for none and see who they are. Blessings to you for your honesty. So we will have a very short one. 1 or 2 songs, short ones. We'll do a quick thing on the, I have about 4 or 5 different sermons on the prodigal son. I love the prodigal son. I will do one of the very short versions of it. And we'll have a good Friday night. Here's how it feels to live on the margins of society. This is from a person in Moldova, which is in the eastern part of Europe and western part of Russia. This is in the area that they were under communism for 70 years, and when the communist wall came down, these poor people suffered horribly. For a poor person, everything is terrible. Illness, humiliation, shame. We are cripples. We are afraid of everything. We depend on everyone. No one needs us. We are like garbage that everyone wants to get rid of. And that's how the people of Moldova felt. Do you remember back in the 70s and 80s, or let's say the early 2000s, all the stories coming out of Eastern Europe of trafficked girls trying to get away from extreme poverty? These were beautiful girls, blonde hair, red hair. They were, and light brown hair, also dark hair, but the light brown, the red, and the blonde, they were trafficked into the Middle East into Saudi Arabia, into Israel. Israel was a major destination for these trafficked girls. And you can get online and read an interview with one of the traffickers named Jacob Golan, who said, I can sell a blonde for $15,000. There's not many blondes in Israel, and the men just love them. These were girls from Moldova and the other Eastern Bloc countries, so that when communism was over, they were in such extreme poverty that parents were abandoning their children. These were informally what we would call Christian countries that had been under communism for so many years. Girls, 16, 17, 18, 19, would be lured with promises of a good job. You can be waitresses, you can be, receptionists at companies, and they're looking for more all the time. Why don't you come into Israel? Why don't you come to Saudi Arabia? Why don't you come to Turkey? And these girls were lining up to go. And as soon as they crossed the border, their passports were taken and torn up, and they found out what their real destination was. They were sold into sexual slavery. And there were these brothels that grew up all over with these forced girls in there. They were coming from these countries in Eastern Europe. And Jacob Golan, $15,000 a girl, said, oh, the guys down here love them because we don't have many like that. Could you imagine? We had a man from the church in Cody, Roy Bessier, whose granddaughter worked in some kind of ministry in Ukraine for several years. When she came back, she gave a talk at our Rotary Club about her experience. And we asked her, we hear stories about trafficking. What do you know about that? And she says, oh, in all the Ukrainian villages, there'll be a 15-year-old girl will all of a sudden just disappear and she's never heard from again. And we don't know where she is, but we know where she is. And it's just horrible. Why? Why would make a girl risk her life like that? No one needs us. We are like garbage that everyone wants to get rid of. And they just need some basic needs met, like food. And they're hoping. And they cannot imagine. I read one story about one of these young girls who was rescued in Israel by the police some years later. And she said, why should something like this happen to a young girl just because I'm so naive? Meaning she didn't know there was that level of evil. Deuteronomy 24 talks about the proper treatment toward the people like these young girls from Moldova. Deuteronomy 24, verses 19 through 21. When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back and get it. I have cucumbers that, because it's a bucket garden, I try to plant things that'll grow well together. And I have cucumbers coming out of the same buckets I have tomato plants and watermelon vines coming out. And I position them to where they're going to grow underneath the tree because the grass I have won't grow under the tree, so the vines can spread out there and I don't have to worry about cutting them when I cut the grass. And I've got some lilac bushes and the cucumber will grow through the lilac bushes. And I try to trim some of the branches out so I can see them, but the leaves will still grow. So you go in there but it's kind of nice looking up here instead of way down here. But you're looking through the lilac bushes and there's a nice cucumber hanging down. But guess what you have to do sometimes? You get to the end of it and you find out the end of a vine that you didn't even know was going through there, so you've got to follow it back through and you find 2 or 3 other cucumbers that you didn't even know were in there. Deuteronomy says don't do that. Leave that vine for the poor girl from Moldova to go through and look for those cucumbers so she can take them home and feed her family. And I'm bringing up Moldova because I don't have any hungry people wandering around Ulysses looking through cucumber vines. Okay, we have agencies today that take care of that. And maybe that's part of a problem too. Maybe if the government stayed out of that and let people, number 1, work, and number 2, let churches be in charge of benevolence, that might be another way that we could get our country back onto old-fashioned values. You will work, but then if you can't, not because you don't want to, but because you can't, like you were a veteran that was injured in war, then we will see that you get the aid you deserve because you gave your legs for your country. That's a totally different thing. Or because you're a single mother and your husband died as a policeman in service to his community. There's another person that deserves help, not giveaway. She gave her husband for the community. She deserves to have her children fed. That's not the same as somebody that just doesn't want to work. Those are cases where benevolence is very deserved and the community responds by helping. But when we allow someone else to come in and say, we'll do that for you, we lose some of that pioneer spirit that made the country great to begin with. You work if you can, we'll help you if you can't. That's what's going on in Deuteronomy 24. So, when you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. You notice each time when he says, when you overlook a sheaf, when you beat the olives, when you harvest the grapes, each time after each specific crop, he says, leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. Why does he repeat the alien, the fatherless, and the widow after each crop? Why didn't he mention olives, sheaves, and grapes, and then throw in the alien, the fatherless, and the widow? Well, one of the ways you emphasize how you feel about something is to repeat it, right? So God is repeating. He mentions a crop, he mentions the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. He mentions a crop, he mentions the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. And what do you think he wants to get through our minds? Is you be concerned about those who are marginalized in society, who are willing to work but don't have a chance, and you provide opportunity. It doesn't mean you give them everything. It means you provide opportunity. And one way you do that is by leaving some of the extra crops on the vines for them to get. Now here's the thing. In Israel, the land was an inheritance to the people. That was God's blessing to them. And they saw the land as God's blessing. God has given us this land. So now they become the conduit we talked about the other day, the conduit of blessing, not the Dead Sea that just collects the blessings and then kills them because they stagnate. You receive the blessing and you pass it on. And of course, as the blessing's coming through, you get a major portion of those blessings. This wealthy farmer has abundant food. He has plenty to take care of. He's got animals, so when his daughter gives birth to a healthy grandson or a healthy granddaughter, he can have a big feast and invite all the neighbors like we talked about last night. Boy, his life is blessed. And one of the ways he thanks God for that is when they've gone through and they've harvested this field out here. The next day he looks out there and there's the widow lady from down the road with her 2 children. They're picking peas. And he can stand there and smile and say, Lord, thank you that you have blessed me enough that I can now bless her life. See, that's how that was supposed to work. That was God's plan for how to help that poor girl in Moldova. This concern is further developed by the Old Testament prophets. Micah accused the nation's leaders of abusing those lacking money and power and robbing them of God's blessings. For example, Micah chapter 2. Micah's way back toward the end of the Old Testament in those things called the minor prophets. And if it takes you a minute to get there, that's okay. It takes me a minute to get there too, because we don't use those books a whole lot. Don't remember where they are. But Micah chapter 2, verses 8 through 9. Micah is preaching about the sins of the nation, and it's just a really neat book to go back and read every once in a while because it just kind of puts into focus what God's concerns are and how far removed we can become from God's concerns. But here God is talking about the effect of false prophets upon the people and how the people are living now. Chapter 2 of Micah, verse 8. Lately my people have risen up like an enemy. You strip off the rich robe from those who pass by without a care, like men returning from battle. You drive the women of my people from their pleasant homes. You take away my blessing from their children forever. What's going on here? The situation of Micah, some have compared to contemporary America, and that is there was something of an economic boom for the people at the upper level of the economic strata, the elites. But for those in the middle class or those of the lower class, they did not see that boon, that blessing. For them, there was more hardship. The middle class are largely the class of people that get up in the morning and milk the cows and make sure the trains are running and make sure the trucks are running and make sure the food is loaded onto the trucks to take to the grocery stores and teach the children and put on the badge to protect the community and drive the ambulances. You know, they're the people that are sitting here, okay, that do the daily work that is required for us to be able to live. The elite are some of those who may own the operations and the businesses we're working in, but they may be way up far removed from that. Their livelihood may not at all be dependent upon what all goes on in the United States. I remember when I was living in Cody that the first Gulf War broke out, and there was a man who owned a 100,000-acre ranch that I got to hunt on some and hunt cows. He not his cows, his cow elk. Yeah. No, I didn't go out and shoot his cows. Come on, I'm not the poor person that was just going through after he harvested and gleaned myself a couple of nice cows. No, this was a ranch that had hundreds of elk on it, and if you made a $25 donation to the Humane Society or some other thing in town, then he allowed you to hunt. So they didn't take the money for themselves. They allowed you to hunt a cow. So we're out there, and he buys this great big dish. Well, this is during the first Gulf War. He is an oil baron from France who bought a ranch in the United States just so he could hunt elk and moose. He didn't need the land for income. It was a way to hide some income. But he had oil and land in the Middle East, including around Kuwait. So when he came out here to hunt, he wanted to be able to come in the afternoon, have this big dish to report on international news so he could see what was happening with his oil wells in Kuwait. That's fairly elite. Okay? In 8th century BC Israel, he was one of the ones that was up here. We were the ones that were down here. And the ones that were down here were being fleeced by some of the dishonest ones that's up here. And that doesn't mean everybody up here is dishonest. Not at all. But it does mean some can be, and in this case they were. And what would sometimes happen would be, here's the inheritance that God gave the Israelites when they entered the promised land, and this land has been passed on for generations. Well, as the population increased, fewer and fewer people were living on the land, and more were being gathered up into cities, much like happened here. So you have fewer farmers. You still have maybe the same number of farmers, but the non-farming population has increased exponentially. So now you've got people living in cities, not on farms. So they're not raising their food, they've got to buy their food. They're not making their own clothes from the sheep they've sheared. They have to buy their clothing. So now you have people that develop businesses of making clothing, making shoes, transporting food and setting up stores and selling food. And that takes money. So now you've got people that develop systems of banking and finance. Now, for the first time in Israel, you have people going into debt. And here is a woman whose husband has died. She's got 3 small children. They had to borrow the crop, the money to plant this crop. The crop didn't make. And now the financier who lives in the city, far removed from this woman and her concerns, sends the agents out who kicks her off the land. And he takes it over and it becomes commercialized farming under some big operation. Now, I understand banking serves a very important purpose in our communities. We've had bankers in our church. This Sunday, I'm going to be away again this Sunday, and it's very likely going to be a Christian banker who gives my sermon this Sunday. I'm not against banking. I wouldn't be driving a truck out there if it wasn't for a bank, okay? But God's concern was when His laws become secondary to the laws that the land develops and that powerful people develop for their own cause. Christian bankers in Europe at one time would allow this woman, after her husband died, and she had paid off so much of a farm, say, if she could not continue to make payment because her husband died and the land needed to be sold, they would allow her a portion of that equity that had been developed or that she had paid for, to receive that, to go some other place and buy someplace smaller that she could live. There they gave concerns. How do we balance God's concern for these people, these middle class or poor people, with our economic system today? And that's the system they worked out. That's not what they were doing in 8th century BC Israel. This woman lost her husband. She's got 3 hungry kids. But the financier comes along and says, get out. No, you don't understand. Get out. It's no longer your land. And keep the kids from crying. They're getting on my nerves. Just get them and get out. You want to know why Israel was destroyed? These 2 verses right here tell you. You drive my women from their inheritances. You drive my women from their pleasant homes. This was land God gave the people all the way back at the time of the conquest, that her father had passed on, or her husband's fathers had passed down to them. She married this man. She is excited. She receives the inheritance intended for all of God's people. And now somebody who doesn't care about God's will says, get off. And when God says, when you have that attitude toward the marginalized of society, then I lose my feeling for you. And you will be treated the way you treat them. What does it mean to be marginalized? And in Proverbs, we have 10 more minutes, right? Just going to see how far I got to get this half. Okay. Here's what it means to be poor or marginalized in the Old Testament. And it's probably going to be very similar to what it is today. I'm going to run through these rather quickly. In Proverbs, it means, number 1, to lack the basic necessities of life, such as food. One of the things I do appreciate about living today is there are agencies in place that can help you if you're hungry, even though I don't think that's the best way to do it. I do think going back to the old system of you work, and if you can't, then the church steps in and the church helps with benevolence. That's what gives opportunity for the church to grow. Acts chapter 6, when caring Christians step in, the church grew. Number 2, lacking social position and control over one's own destiny. Lacking social position or lacking control over one's destiny. We all have a sense that we are in control of our destiny. And yet, people far more powerful than us in positions far removed from us in New York City and in the Netherlands, in some of the key banking houses there, and in some of the business enterprises around the world, the central cities, they can make decisions about what the interest rates are going to be, where we're going to open up new avenues of trade, what avenues we're going to cut off. And our economic fortunes can be changed overnight without us having any say in the matter whatsoever. That's what it's like to be marginalized. Fortunately, there's still in America, in Canada, and other countries of the West, we can own land and we can plant food, But there's many places in the world where the people can't do that. They're just really at the whim of those who make decisions for them. Number 3, in ancient Israel, it meant living on the margins of society and lacking such basic dignity as being shown respect and fair treatment. You're looked down on if you don't have what some other people have. Here's some of the specific hardships that were suffered by the poor and the abused and the marginalized. A constant dread of ruin. Being shunned and even deserted by one's friends, Proverbs 19. Subject to being hated, mocked, treated harshly, and denied help. And I'm rushing through these quickly because of time. I will tell you this, some of you you're so good about taking notes. I appreciate that. I'll wait to the end to tell you this, but because I don't want to deprive you of the opportunity of taking notes. But I'll email you all these notes if you want. So if you miss something, that's why I don't feel too bad about rushing right now, because I'll send you the notes later and you can have the references. There was a Jewish proverb in ancient times that said, in order to chase away beggars, one needs a rich person. Now, if you're rich, Several of you chuckled. You're probably not rich. If you think of yourself as rich, you may not have chuckled. But I will say this, I doubt anybody here is really rich in the sense that some people in this world are, like Rothschilds, if I can mention some names. I don't know if you've ever studied the history of the Rothschilds. I don't think they know how much money they have. Even some of the Rockefellers, when you put several of the brothers together, I don't know if you can even estimate how many billions they have and what it's like to have that level of opulence. But what this Jewish proverb is saying is that the wealthier you become, the more you get asked by people for a gift or for something, and the more you have to start saying no, 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 no. Otherwise, you will be begged to death, right? So to chase away a beggar, some of us might be standing there thinking, what do we do for this person? Well, the motel is $80. I've got $11. You've got $9. How much do you have? Can we put enough together to get him a room? We can buy him something to eat. What should we do? You want to get rid of the beggar? Get a rich person. They're used to it. Hey, get out of here. We don't need you here. Okay? That Jewish proverb grew out of experience within the Jewish community of the rich man and Lazarus, for example. Okay? They can be exploited financially by those in power, and finally, they are wretched. Well, how does it feel to live this kind of marginalized life? Well, in Latvia, here's another quote. This is from Corbett and Fickert in the book When Helping Hurts. And the book is written with the idea that you can help people to the point of doing them more harm. You can hurt by helping. And there's a line. We'll look at that in the second part. Here's someone from Latvia. During the last past 2 years, we have not celebrated any holidays with others. We cannot afford to invite anyone to our house, and we feel uncomfortable visiting others without bringing a present. The lack of contact leaves one depressed and creates a constant feeling of unhappiness and a sense of low self-esteem. Now, why am I talking about this in a class on leadership? Because they did not erase it, I did. And they did this artwork because I thought it was really good, and they asked if they could use it, and I said yes. So they didn't erase this. I erased it yesterday, or said they could. Community, remember? Integrity. Thank you. Listening. I was trying to think what was yesterday. I wasn't listening. I was talking. Right, Bodie? I remember. Okay. As leaders, okay, some of these marginalized people are going to find their way in our community. What do we owe them as leaders? You know, what do we owe them as leaders? That's why we're talking about this. We'll talk a little bit more about what we owe them later. But if they come into our community, if God has brought them there, then it's not our right to say, we don't accept people like you. You know, we don't accept widows with 3 children that can't afford to feed them. You need to go someplace else where they care about people like you. We don't. Can the church do that? Oh man, the church better not. The church better not. Here's what a poor person in the church in the United States said. And I interviewed this person for this project I was working on. They lived with a constant dread of ruin. I used to worry about that, about being poor, but I made sure that we had at least something to live in, a tent. When the house burned down, I didn't have anything. We went to a shelter. They said, we get used to being shunned. We don't let it bother us anymore. We have a saying, dear God, they know not what they do. They shun us because they think we are bad or are poor by choice. Proverbs does teach that people can become poor because of choice. You can be lazy. And it talks about the lazy son who refuses to go out and work in the harvest. He is a shame and he is an embarrassment. He brings reproach upon the family and obviously hunger. But the diligent son who gets up and goes works the harvest, that is the wise son. Okay, so there he's working. The corresponding verse for the woman would be, the wise woman builds her house, while with her own hands the foolish woman tears hers down. She is working just as hard. She may not be picking the vine or the beans off the vine or the plant, but she is preparing them for the meal. She's preparing them to be stored for winter, and she's making sure the kids are clean. This young man, this young woman, they're both working very hard. Proverbs acknowledges their work and says that's a noble woman, that's a noble man. But it also acknowledges there are the lazy who refuse to go out and work, and there are those who, because of bad spirit and attitudes, tear their own family apart, and they're foolish. But there are people, because of injustice, that become poor, such as Proverbs 13:23. Proverbs 13:23 says, a poor man's field may produce abundant food, but injustice sweeps it away. One of the last crops of watermelon my wife's grandfather produced on his farm was stolen. He and his people worked all day, and when his people, this was before I married her, so I don't know if it was just family members or people he had hired hands. They picked all the watermelon and stacked them on the side of the road out in the country by their farm. And the next morning they were all gone. Has anybody here ever moved watermelon? That is one of the hardest jobs. Where have you done it? Kentucky. I've done it in Florida. That is one of the hottest, most tiring jobs I've ever had. Hauling the watermelon out of the field and stacking them. Or one day I also worked with loading them. You get a line of guys and you throw the watermelon, and you do that 4 or 5 hours, these heavy watermelon, then somebody in the truck stacking them, 120 or 30 degree heat. That is work. And to do that all day and to find the next morning that the whole load is gone, injustice swept all his work away. And Proverbs acknowledges that can happen. There's also a verse in Ecclesiastes. I don't use this one enough, so it's going to take a minute to find it. But if I can get it in time, it is about, okay, if you see the poor oppressed, this is Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 8. If you see the poor oppressed in a district and justice and rights denied, don't be surprised. Solomon says, you know, when you see somebody stealing from those who are working hard, don't be surprised. Why not? Here's what he says. For one official is eyed by a higher one, and over them both are higher officials, or others are higher still. The increase from the land is taken by all. The king himself profits from the fields. Solomon was a king. And here's what he's writing. Here is the dirt farmer. He's out there every day on his hands and knees, pulling weeds, planting. He and his wife are watering the crop. He's raising his children to learn how to farm, and they make a certain amount. But as they make the money and they sell the produce, there's this official and this official and this official reaching their hand into the till and pulling money out. People that didn't do any work for it. And Solomon says that's an injustice. But he also says don't be surprised by it, because that's what government does. Did you know that's in the Bible? You know, we know from our own experience in our American history what that was like. But even Solomon says don't be surprised. That's what government does. They take from those who work. Injustice sweeps away the hard work of the poor. So, Proverbs does teach that people can become poor through their own choices and behavior, but they can also become poor because of injustice. And God's concern is that the poor not be reduced to insignificance in their communities, but they be received as full members of God's community. And in a moment we will talk about how leaders regard the poor and what their ministry to them is like. And in our churches in America, we may not have really poor people, financially oppressed, that don't have any chance coming to our churches. There may be some. But in America, if you're willing to do if you're willing to do something, there's something you can do. Some kind of work to at least get something toward your cause of betterment and improvement. So we may not have some of the people like the level of Moldova in the 90s. But there will still be people coming to our churches that will need some kind of financial help, or they are marginalized, or they have a handicap, or they have something that has made them feel outside. Maybe it's a little boy or a girl that's been abused and they don't know how to fit into a group. They're marginalized. Maybe it's someone that has suffered a tragic loss in their family and they haven't adjusted to that person not being in their family anymore. They're marginalized. What do you do to bring them in? And we'll look at some of those things when we come back after the break.